noon on the 25th of June, 1944. 6 miles off the coast of France. If you are standing on the open navigation bridge of the battleship Texas, you can see the guns that are about to find you. They sit on the high ground east of Cherbourg, sunk into concrete a man could not see over. 4 heavy naval rifles the Germans call Battery Hamburg. Those guns can throw a shell farther than your own guns can throw one back. Your captain knows that. He has done the one thing the gunnery manual warns against. He has brought a slow battleship, a ship laid down before the last war, in close to a coastal battery that outranges her, and he has turned her broadside to the shore so that every 14-inch gun she carries can bear at once. In a few minutes, the German gunners will stop waiting. A shell will come down through the top of the armored conning tower and take the helmsman off the wheel. Another will punch through the hull below the waterline. A third will tumble in without going off and come to rest, live, in an officer's bunk. And through all of it, Texas will keep firing, 2 guns at a time, slow and even, into a slit in the concrete no wider than a doorway. This is the story of how 3 old American battleships answered a fortress that Adolf Hitler ordered held to the last man. Cherbourg was the deep water port the whole invasion needed, and the guns of the port faced the sea, set in casemates the field artillery could not crack, and the bombers kept missing. So the United States Navy sent the Nevada, the Texas, and the Arkansas to stand in close and duel the fortress batteries gun for gun. By the middle of that afternoon, one of Battery Hamburg's 4 rifles was a wreck of torn steel, and the ship that did it never left the water. Here is how a battleship fights a gun set in 6 feet of concrete, and what that kind of fight actually costs. The fortress was Cherbourg, the deep water port the invasion could not do without. Cherbourg sat at the tip of the Cotentin Peninsula, and it was the reason the Allies had come ashore where they did. The invasion beaches could feed an army for a while over open sand, but not forever, and not through a channel storm. What the campaign needed was a working harbour with deep water and cranes and rail, and Cherbourg was the only one for 100 miles. Every planner on the Allied side had a red circle around it before a single boot touched Normandy. The Germans understood the same map. They had spent years turning the port into one of the strongest points on the whole Atlantic wall. Then the weather turned the red circle into a matter of survival. On the 19th of June, a gale blew up in the channel and did not let go for 3 days. Tore the American artificial harbour off Omaha Beach apart. That harbour was the whole Allied answer to having no port of their own, a great chain of concrete caissons and floating piers towed across from England and sunk into place, and the storm wrecked it past saving. More than 20 of the concrete caissons were destroyed, and the piers were smashed. The landing craft caught in the open were thrown up onto the sand. Overnight, the supply plan lost the harbour it had counted on, and everything now rode on taking a real one. The only real one within reach was Cherbourg. The pressure on the men closing in from the south and on the ships that would back them went up hard. The defense faced 2 directions at once. Toward the land, A belt of pillboxes, wire, minefields, and flooded ground ringed the city. Toward the sea, a line of coastal batteries in reinforced concrete, built to sink anything that tried to force the harbor from the water. 20 casemated batteries covered the approaches. Some mounted the lighter guns, the 75mm and the 88mm that could reach a landing craft. The heavy ones were another matter. The strongest of them all stood on the heights near the village of Furmanville, 6 miles east of the port. The Germans called it Battery Hamburg. Carried 4 naval rifles of 240mm caliber, each one in its own concrete casemate, and it could throw a shell more than 25,000 yards out to sea. Range figure is the whole problem in one number. A battleship of the Texas class could reach out to about 23,000 yards with her 14-inch guns at full elevation. Battery Hamburg could reach farther. It meant there was a stretch of water where the German battery could hit a ship and the ship could not hit back. To fight Battery Hamburg at all, a captain had to sail his ship into that stretch and keep going, taking fire he could not answer until he closed the range enough to bring his own guns to bear. In command of the fortress was a general Hitler had chosen by name. Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben had fought on the Eastern Front, and he had few illusions about what was coming. His orders left him no room at all. Hitler's message to him was blunt. Even in the worst case, it read, it was his duty to defend the last bunker and leave to the enemy not a harbor, but a field of ruins. Schlieben understood exactly what that meant. He was not being told to win, only to make the port worthless and to spend his garrison doing it. When the American commander demanded his surrender on the 22nd of June, Schlieben rejected it. He had already asked Berlin for permission to give up, and Berlin had refused him. So the fortress held, and the American infantry paid for every yard. The land assault fell to the 7th Corps under General Joe Collins. 3 divisions ground in from the south, the 4th, the 9th and the 79th, closing on the city through country the Germans had flooded and mined and zeroed in. It was slow, expensive work. The pillboxes had to be taken one at a time, by men with satchel charges and pole charges and flamethrowers under fire from ground. The defenders knew by heart. The infantry could deal with the landward ring, given time and casualties. What the infantry could not deal with was the coastal guns. The sea batteries were built to take punishment. A casemate at Battery Hamburg was a block of reinforced concrete 6 feet thick, with a gun set back in a throat of a firing slit that faced the water. A field gun firing from behind the American lines could not hit that slit. A bomb dropped from altitude almost never found it either. The Allies had tried the air. Heavy and medium bombers worked the peninsula for days, and the casemates shrugged most of it off. A near miss through dirt. A direct hit on the concrete roof, when it came at all, cracked and scorched and left the gun inside, still able to fire. The one way to kill a gun in a casemate was to put a heavy shell through the slit itself, or square onto the face, and to do that you needed a gun heavy enough and an aimer close enough to thread it. Nothing the 7th Corps carried could reach the sea batteries from the land side and do that. The infantry could take the city, but the fortress guns covered the harbor and the flank. While they lived, they could reach out and hit anything the Navy brought near, and somebody had to go and fight them where they stood. The answer came from the water, and it was old. The 3 battleships sent to Cherbourg were not new ships. Texas had been commissioned in 1914. Arkansas was older still. Nevada had been raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor, patched and sent back to war. They were slow, they were coal and oil veterans of another age, and that was precisely why they could be risked here. The fast new battleships were needed elsewhere and were too valuable to park inside the range of coastal guns. The old ones could be spent. What they carried was the thing that mattered. Texas mounted 10 14-inch guns. A single one of those shells weighed close to 1,500 pounds and came in flat and hard, and, unlike a bomb, it could be walked onto a target by men who watched where the last one fell and corrected. A battleship was, in the end, the one weapon in the theater that could deliver a heavy armor-piercing shell straight into the face of a casemate at a range where the crew could actually aim it. These were not untested ships. 2 weeks earlier, on the morning of the 6th of June, Texas had stood off the Normandy coast. In the opening half hour of the invasion, she fired more than 250 14-inch shells at Pointe du Hoc, working the cliff top where the 2nd Ranger Battalion was about to climb. She had already spent a morning proving her old guns could reach a coastal strongpoint and pound it. Nevada carried a harder story still. She had been sunk at her moorings at Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, the one battleship that managed to get underway that morning, beached and burning by the end of it. The Navy raised her out of the harbor mud, rebuilt her, and sent her back to the war. The ships that came to Cherbourg were survivors, and they could be risked in a way the newest battleships could not. Both of those things were why they were the ones chosen for a job this dangerous. The force was built for exactly this fight. It sailed as Task Force 129 under Rear Admiral Morton Deo, who had run the bombardment off Utah Beach on the morning of the 6th. Deo split his ships into 2 groups. His own group took Nevada, 2 American heavy cruisers, 2 British light cruisers, and a screen of destroyers. The second group formed around Texas and Arkansas under Rear Admiral Carlton Bryant, who rowed aboard Texas herself. Around the battleships worked 11 destroyers and 3 squadrons of minesweepers, because the water off Cherbourg was thick with mines and somebody had to clear a path in before the big ships could reach their firing line. There was one more wrinkle, and it shaped the whole day. 3 days earlier, a bombing run had fallen short and hit American troops. General Collins, unwilling to risk it again, had cancelled the plan for the ships to shell the land defenses on a set schedule. The battleships were to hold their fire. They would shoot only if the 7th Corps called for a specific target or if the coastal guns fired on them first. The Navy was sailing into the range of the heaviest guns on the peninsula under orders not to shoot until it was shot at. That is the situation Texas steamed into a little after noon on the 25th of June. The fight opened just after noon on the 25th of June. The water that day, grey and choppy, the coast a low smudge with the concrete just visible on the high ground. But the battleships could not simply steam up to their firing line because the approaches to Cherbourg were sown thick with mines. The Germans had spent months seeding the water with them, and a single one could open a battleship's bottom. So the minesweepers went first. 3 squadrons of them worked ahead of the heavy ships, sweeping narrow lanes through the mined water, and they did it in the open, under the muzzles of the coastal guns, before a single battleship reached the line. The small ships took the first risk of the day, so the big ones could get close enough to shoot. Texas came into her fire support area a little before 10 in the morning and worked in behind the minesweepers, feeling for the edge of the German range. Arkansas came in beside her. On the bridge of Texas, Captain Charles Baker had refused the safer post inside the armored conning tower and stood out on the open navigation bridge where he could see. Rear Admiral Bryant was aboard. The chaplain, Legrande Moody, had rigged himself to the public address system so he could tell the crew below decks what was happening above them. At about 8 minutes past 12, Arkansas fired first. And then, for a long stretch, nothing came back. The German gunners at Battery Hamburg held their fire. They watched the 2 battleships work in closer, and they waited, because every minute the ships closed brought them deeper into the range where the German guns could hit, and the American guns still could not reach back. It was discipline, and it was a trap that very nearly worked. At about 12:30, the trap sprang. The German battery opened up all at once, ranging on both battleships and on the destroyers screening them. A shell struck Texas low on the port side, below the waterline, a 6-inch hit that flooded a compartment but did not stop her. Around the ship, the sea stood up in columns as the heavy shells came down. Over the next 2.5 hours, the German gunners would straddle Texas more than 65 times, which is to say more than 65 salvos fell close enough to bracket her, near enough to soak the decks and rattle the plating. To straddle a ship is to have the range. The next round in a straddle can be the one that hits. Texas began her answer at about 20 minutes to 1 and did not really stop. She fired her 14-inch guns 2 at a time, slow and deliberate, spotting each fall and correcting, working the shells toward the firing slits on the high ground. Over the afternoon, she put more than 214-inch shells onto the German positions. This was not the fast, blind hammering people imagine, but patient, ugly, close-range gunnery against a target built to survive it, with the gun crews below decks feeling the ship shudder and knowing that somewhere out there 4 German rifles were walking their own salvos onto them by the same method. At about 1:15, the German gunners found the bridge. A heavy shell came down through the top of the armored conning tower, sheared off a fire director, and drove into the support column below the navigation bridge where the captain stood. The blast peeled the pilot house deck upward, as one account put it, as if it were tin. Captain Baker was knocked flat and came up unhurt. The man on the wheel was not so lucky. Quartermaster 3rd Class Kristen Christensen, the helmsman, died at his post. Around him, 11 other men were down, wounded on the bridge and in the fire control tower above it. The chaplain, Moody, had been briefly knocked cold. When he came to, he went to work on the wounded. The executive officer, Commander José Cabanillas, climbed up into the wreckage to see whether the ship could still be steered and fought. He could. Steering shifted below, and the guns kept firing. Texas held her station and kept working the German battery. Then came the strange one. A little before 3 o'clock, deep inside the ship, someone found a shell that had no business being there. 240mm round, one of Battery Hamburg's own, had punched clean through the hull, tumbled through the ship without exploding, and come to rest in a warrant officer's stateroom, unfired and live. Had it gone off, it would have opened the ship's guts. It sat there instead, a dud, and later it was carefully diffused and kept aboard as the luckiest object on the ship, where it is still with Texas today. That live shell tells you something honest about the fight, and it is worth saying plainly. 2 calibers of German shell struck Texas that day. The round that peeled the bridge was lobbed as a heavier hit, and the dud pulled from the stateroom was the 240mm of Battery Hamburg. Texas was under fire from more than one battery at once, and the records of exactly which gun fired which round do not all agree. What is not in doubt is what Texas gave back. At around 35 minutes past 1, one of her 14-inch salvos went home on the high ground and destroyed one of Battery Hamburg's 4 guns outright, gun and casemate together. She had done the thing the bombers could not. She had put a heavy shell where it needed to go and wrecked a coastal rifle in its concrete. Texas did not fight that duel alone, and the cost was shared down the line. The destroyers took it worst for their size. The German gunners hit 2 of them, the Barton and the Laffey, with rounds that failed to explode, which was the only reason those ships survived. Faulty German ammunition ran all through the day and saved a great deal of American steel and a great many American lives, the dud in the Texas stateroom among them. Not every ship was so fortunate. The destroyer O'Brien was hit hard, a shell into the area of her command spaces, and she lost 13 of her crew. Admiral Deo's group had its own fight a few miles to the west. Nevada worked the batteries there alongside 2 American heavy cruisers, the Tuscaloosa and the Quincy, their 8-inch guns adding to the weight of shell falling on the concrete, while the destroyers laid smoke to blind the German rangefinders. The flagship business fell heavily on the 2 British light cruisers attached to the group, Glasgow and Enterprise, which drew a storm of fire as they worked in close. Glasgow was hit twice and stayed in the fight. Nevada, the 3rd battleship, was straddled again and again and took holes in her superstructure. She rode out a near miss that fell within 25 feet of her hull. Every ship in close that day was shot at by guns built specifically to sink them. The battleships did not capture Cherbourg. Ground troops did that, the infantry of the 7th Corps grinding through the pillboxes house by house and bunker by bunker. What the ships did was fight the fortress guns. They stood into a range where they could be hit and could not always hit back. They drew the fire of the heavy coastal batteries onto themselves and away from the men closing on the land side. and they beat those batteries down enough to matter. Admiral Deo said as much afterward, and he did not oversell it. A casemated gun, he judged, was exceedingly difficult for a rapidly maneuvering warship to destroy by direct hit alone. Across the whole force, the naval gunfire that day disabled the great majority of its assigned targets and destroyed almost none of them outright. The value was not in the count of guns smashed, but in the guns silenced, the crews driven back from their sights, the batteries suppressed at the exact moment the assault needed them quiet. Texas proved that a battleship could kill a casemate gun. The fleet proved that the battleship could hold a whole fortress line's attention and take its best and keep firing. The enemy said so himself. The German naval commander in the West, Admiral Krancke, recorded in his war diary that the fall of Cherbourg owed much to a naval bombardment of a hitherto unequalled fierceness. That is the assessment that counts, because it came from the side on the receiving end of the 14-inch guns. The fortress did not last much longer. On the 26th of June, the day after the ships broke off and turned for England, General von Schlieben surrendered along with more than 800 of his men, giving himself up to General Manton Eddy of the 9th Infantry Division. General Omar Bradley was angry enough at the cost of the last stand that he refused to receive Schlieben in person. Scattered positions held out a few days more, and by the 29th of June, organized resistance in Cherbourg had collapsed. The fortress Hitler had ordered held to the last man had fallen in a week. Schlieben had obeyed one part of his orders, even as he failed the other. Before the garrison quit, German engineers had done to the harbor exactly what Hitler demanded. They wrecked it with method. Cranes were toppled, quays blown, the electrical and heating plants destroyed, the breakwater cratered, and the entrance blocked with ships sunk in the channel and salted with mines and delayed charges. The naval commander who ran the demolition, Rear Admiral Walter Hennecke, had his reward the day after he surrendered. Hitler awarded him the Knight's Cross by radio for what the citation called a feat unprecedented in the annals of coastal defense. An American engineer who later stood in the ruins and had to make the port work again put it in flatter words. The demolition of Cherbourg, he reported, was the most complete, intensive, and best planned demolition in history. It was months before the harbor moved cargo in real quantity. That last fact is sometimes taken as proof the victory did not count. Does not. The demolition was the act of a beaten garrison, the spite of men who could no longer hold the ground and so ruined it on the way out. It measures how completely the fortress had lost, not how well it fought. The port was taken, and so was the city. And the coastal guns that were supposed to make the sea a death ground, the guns that outranged the ships and hit them and caused casualties aboard them, had been fought to a standstill. 3 old battleships had sailed straight into their range and would not leave until the job was done. Weigh what the 14-inch gun actually did at Cherbourg. It was the only weapon in the theater that could carry a heavy, armor-piercing shell up to the face of a concrete casemate and put it through the slit. Texas proved it could, destroying one of Battery Hamburg's rifles where the bombers had failed for days. could soak up the fire of the strongest battery on the peninsula and hold its station while men died on its bridge, and it did, and it came home. Texas took her wounded and her one dead man and her live shell and steamed for Portland, and within about 2 weeks she was ready for action again. The ship laid down before the First World War had gone toe-to-toe with a fortress in the second one and won the duel. Did you serve aboard one of the old battle wagons, the Texas, or the Nevada, or the Arkansas, or did your father or grandfather? Did you ever stand on the deck of Texas herself, where she rests now, and see that lucky shell they still keep aboard? Tell it in the comments, because the men who fought that gunnery duel are worth remembering by name. And tell us which pairing you want next. The fortress gun against the siege gun. The pillbox line against the shell that finally cracked it. There is a long list of the guns Germany called unbreakable, and the American guns that answered them, and we will take them one at a time.